Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our March Lunch and Learn. My name is Amanda Castaneda. I am the Shumla Archaeology Director. If this is, I know it's not many of you's first time, but if this is your first time joining us for a presentation, Shumla is a nonprofit organization, and we're dedicated to preserving and studying the rock art of the Lower Pecos, sort of in Southwest Texas. And we do that through documentation, research, stewardship, and education. And today I'm going to be talking about an ongoing project of ours that we started last year in 2025, which is the Rattlesnake Canyon Pictograph Preservation Project, which is indeed a tongue twister. So I'll try to just keep that short, maybe P cubed, as Karen likes to call it. So really briefly, just to situate us again, if you've never been with us before, the region where we work is the Lower Pecos cultural area, or the Lower Pecos archaeological region, and it's located along the Texas-Mexico border, sort of at the intersection of the Devils River, the Pecos River, and the Rio Grande. And we know of over 350 rock art sites in this region, just on the north side of the Rio Grande. And there are multiple styles of rock art produced here from at least 6,000 years ago until European colonization. And if you've not been lucky enough to visit, this is what it looks like. This region is characterized by incised Cretaceous limestone canyons, and that house thousands of rock shelters and caves. It's a karstic environment. Some of these rock shelters are quite large. You can see people down here for scale as they climb up this steep slope. And as I said, this sort of dry environment, it preserves a really impressive tradition of pictographs, which are painted images. We don't have nearly the amount of petroglyphs like you see further in the desert Southwest. But these pictographs span over 6,000 years of human history. And we currently have sort of 5 recognized styles in the region that we see repeated at different sites. And today we're going to focus on 2 of those styles, or rather the sites that we're talking about have 2 of those styles, which is Pecos River style, which is sort of what we're known for, the region's known for, and then imagery that dates to the historic period. So we kind of get the full range there, some of the oldest to some of the most recent. And that's all the intro I'm going to give you today because I want to be able to spend time talking about our project. So for our journey today, just to give you a little bit of a sort of a path for our presentation, first I'm going to be talking about Rattlesnake Canyon sort of in a background sense, talk about the sites that are involved, briefly discuss past work that have been done there and what we knew about the sites going into the project last year from previous documentation. We're going to talk about the goals and the methods and also the research questions of this project, right? For any project that we do, we want to have a strong research design, which includes all of these things. We're going to talk a little bit about the progress and the results thus far, and then also our future plans. So that's going to be our roadmap for this presentation. Before I jump into the background, I first want to acknowledge our partners. Without these partners, this project would not be possible. So the canyon is jointly owned and managed by Texas Tech University and the National Park Service, Amistad National Recreation Area. For the Texas Tech part of it, Robert Stubblefield and Karen Lopez out of their Junction campus have been incredibly instrumental for us to do this work. Robert is in the cowboy hat and Karen's in the orange tank top. And so Texas Tech is a proud steward of these sites. They own the majority of these sites. Land ownership around the reservoir gets a little bit complicated, but only in that NPS owns land up to the I think it's 1,144.3 feet above sea level, that line. And so the National Park Service, Jack Johnson here on the right, he's the park archaeologist. They are also our partners on this project as well. And so they owned a little bit of the canyon going up from the Rio Grande and just a tiny bit of the sites. So these are really great people to work with, and we feel really lucky to partner with them. So I just want to give them a quick shout out. So first, I want to start by characterizing the canyon. I want to talk about the canyon a little bit, the sites in it, the importance of these sites, and why we are... there's a little bit of echo there.
Sorry.
And talk about why we're prioritizing them. So this canyon is home to 4 pictograph sites that are all in really close proximity to one another. They're within 2/10 of a mile, or under 1,000 feet. So think less than one lap around the track. So they're pretty close together in the canyon, and you can see they're also pretty close to the Rio Grande. So out here in the background, this sort of brown coloration is the Rio Grande, or the Rio Bravo, which makes that side Mexico. So we'll start with the first site that's the most well-known. And this site was named after the canyon, so it's called the Rattlesnake Canyon site. And it was first visited by Mary Virginia Carson in the Whitty, she was with the Whitty Museum in 1931. And she did watercolors of sites all across the region. And around the same time, A.T. Jackson, who was an archaeologist from UT, also visited. He called this site 73A in his 1938 publication. A few years later, Forrest Kirkland also visited and captured the site with his own watercolor renderings. That was in 1936. And it's really no wonder why this site was so well known that early, why it was visited so much, because Rattlesnake Canyon is one of the most significant Pecos River style sites in the Lower Pecos. It's really well preserved. It's really densely painted. The panel spans about 32 meters. It has all 4 colors of paint that are often seen in Pecos River style, really well preserved. So blacks, reds, yellows, and whites. Arguably, as Pecos River style is, a world-renowned rock art style, we think the site is, we would argue it's one of the most significant sites in North America and arguably the world. But it's certainly up there in terms of its preservation and its iconography. Here's another view. So just a truly remarkable panel. The scale of it is really impressive. The tallest figure is about 2 meters tall. And Rattlesnake Canyon is part of NHL, or National Historic Landmark designation, for the Lower Pecos Canyonlands Archaeological District. And that district includes 35 sites as sort of a representative of the great cultural sites that we have in the region. And so this was established in 2021. But I will say, apart from the paintings on the wall, there is some cultural deposits as well on the ground level or in the dirt. There's some burned rock. There's other sort of debitage or flint knapping debris, stuff that you would expect to see in a site. But largely, the flooding in the canyon has impacted these deposits, so a lot of it has washed away or is covered by gravels. And the last thing I want to point out in this photo that we'll come back to is this kind of line right here, where it turns from really vibrant imagery above to sort of this dusty coloration down below. So just keep that line in mind. So the next site that I want to talk about in this canyon is 41VB 204. So this is a large overhang, a pretty good size overhang, situated low in the canyon. And it was also visited by Jackson in the 30s, and he referred to this as 73C. So Rattlesnake Canyon, he called 73A, and he basically considered all of these sites as one. There's a little bit of separation in between, but I think even he could tell that at one point this would have been one long painted surface. There's no cultural deposits at this site, really primarily due to flooding events. But in 1984 and 1992, different folks went to the site to fill out Tex site forms, which is the Texas State Archaeological Site Form. And they said, the pictographs are mostly eroded. There's some Pecos River style motif still visible, but all of the deposits had been washed away. So that's, before we went to the canyon and went to this site to do documentation, that's what we knew about it. Really close by, the next site is 41VB 205. It's known as Missionary Shelter. This is another sort of large overhang that was also visited by some of those early folks. So Mary Virginia Carson, Jackson, and Kirkland. They all created renderings of it in different ways. Kirkland and Carson did watercolors. And then this photograph here is from the 1938 Jackson book. And it's a pretty abysmal scan, honestly. This book is incredibly difficult to find. and very expensive. But it's hard to know if the imagery was really this vibrant because sometimes Jackson did draw over the images if we're in the book, but it was at least at that time in the 30s, it was visible enough that folks were able to go and create these watercolor renderings of them. But by the time Dr. Solveig Turpin came in 1984 and then the NPS crew in 1992, they said that the historic imagery was pretty much gone. It was really not visible to the naked eye, only just tiny remnants of paint rather. And then they also noted traces of earlier paint, perhaps Pecos River style, up higher on the wall, but it was just traces. And so in the span of 55 years, from the early 30s to the mid 80s, the historic imagery had almost completely disappeared. And then finally, the last site in the canyon that we are working at is 41 VV 628, which is known as Vibora Shelter. It was first recorded by Ron Ralph in 1984, and he described the site as, the pictographs are faded, but he recognized Pecos River style figures, and he said this would have been a really sort of impactful panel as you're coming up the canyon. It would have been the first bit of paint that you saw before heading into this really densely painted area. But the NPS crew in 1992 called it unspectacular. So we were not necessarily expecting to have, a lot of stuff preserved because we knew this canyon had been impacted by flooding and all the tech site forms were saying, remnant, fragmentary, eroded, not much left. So that's what we were working with before we went to the sites last year. So, as I mentioned before, all of these sites, these four sites are within a quarter-mile stretch. And so this would have created an extensive gallery. If you think about walking through this landscape, it's a pretty tight canyon, almost like a slot canyon. It's really narrow. There's the canyon walls are close to you on each side. And so as you're coming up from the Rio Grande or perhaps walking downstream towards the Rio Grande, there would have been this quarter-mile stretch of just an explosion of color and just really, a really impressive gallery that once would have been there. But as I've said, these sites are low in the canyon and they've been largely impacted by flooding for hundreds to probably thousands of years. So I want to talk a little bit about flooding before continuing. Um, if you've been to the Lower Pecos, you probably know that flooding can be an issue. But if you haven't, you're thinking, okay, this is a desert environment. Surely it's not, why is flooding an issue? But there is evidence for both small and large scale flooding from the early Holocene to present day. We know that large scale flooding occurred prehistorically from different excavated sites. So on the left, Arenosa Shelter is on the Pecos River, and it's just perfect layer cake stratigraphy of flood deposits mixed with cultural deposits and flood deposits. On a smaller scale, on the right, we have Sales Adobe, which is a terrace site along the Rio Grande. And again, you have sort of this big flood deposit, a nice lens of cultural material. You can see the charcoal stained sediment, the burned rock, and then another flood deposit. Historically speaking, in more recent times, there was a record-setting flood in June of 1954 from Hurricane Alice. And this example, this photograph is from the Pecos Bridge at the time. It wasn't the high bridge that it was today, but it was still decently high above the riverbed, and this flood completely washed it off its pillars. So it destroyed the bridge here. And this event eventually led, or was part of what eventually led to the building of Lake Amistad, because as you can imagine, all this water coming down the Pecos and the Rio Grande eventually made its way downstream to Del Rio, Acuna, and other small villages, and caused a lot of destruction downstream. But when you build a reservoir, you're helping the downstream flooding issues, but it also kind of creates other sort of dynamics upstream, right, after you've created this body of water. So a little discussion about hydrology and different types of flooding. So this is Eagle Nest Canyon. It's also sort of in the western part of Val Verde County, similar to Rattlesnake. And this is during what we call a slack water flood. So this is July 2010. Hurricane Alex had come into the Gulf and into Mexico, and sort of the bands as they went off into our region, they dropped anywhere between 5 to 10 inches over several days across a pretty large area. And so the ground was saturated. It wasn't necessarily any one major wall of water. It just sort of slowly built up a slow moving, filled to the brim Rio Grande here. And that slack water backs up into the canyons and tributaries that are along it. So this is a site called Skyles Shelter. This is Kelly Cave. And so this water sits here and is moving fairly slowly, so it drops a lot of its silt load. And so that can cause damage in other ways. So an example of that at Rattlesnake Canyon, we know this happened in 2008 there. A similar slackwater flood backed up from Amistad, and it sat in Rattlesnake Canyon and in the site for an unknown amount of time. But the pictographs, if you remember that line where it was brightly colored on top and then sort of a dusty brown, that is that line that you're seeing there. So that is silt dropped from these slackwater deposits. So this is definitely something that we're concerned about. It obscures the figures. It accelerates the deterioration. We really don't have a good way of removing that deposit from the shelter walls. The other type of flooding that occurs is what, more like flash flooding or down canyon, which can often have really alarming velocity and big walls of water. So this is the same two sites I showed previously in Eagle Nest Canyon. So it's Skyles Shelter, Kelly Cave, and the Rio Grande in the background over there. And this particular flood in 2014 happened, I think there was like 11 inches of rain that fell in 6 hours. And so a much bigger amount of rain in a much shorter amount of time, years worth of rain, really. And so that creates situations like this. So this is that same flood at the head of Eagle Nest Canyon, where you have every pour off becomes a waterfall, which is really pretty magical. And we always want rain. Rain is a good thing, but we don't typically like to get it all at once. And so this was Eagle Nest Canyon. We were not able to be in Rattlesnake Canyon at the time of this flood, but we do know that it altered the canyon pretty dramatically. So on the left is taken before the 2014 flood. You can see all the trees and vegetation in the bottom. And then on the right is the trees are either wiped out or they're covered by gravel. When you have this high velocity of water coming down the canyon, it can move a lot of a heavier load. So you have a lot of gravel being moved from places, redeposited elsewhere, covering vegetation, and also importantly, raising the elevation of the canyon floor. And so now with the canyon floor being a couple meters higher than it was previously, those slack water floods that come up from the Rio Grande are going to sit even higher on the panel. And so these are it's flooding in two different ways, but both of them are huge threats to these sites. And so that was really a large reason why Shumla prioritized these 4 sites for documentation. Here's an example. So inside the shelter, here's Robert Stubblefield from Texas Tech. You can see the flood debris from the 2014 flood in the shelter. It's hard to know how high the water got at that time. This line right here is probably from the 2008 flood, the slack water flood that sat and dropped its silt deposit. So either way, not great things going on there. There's also other threats to Rattlesnake Canyon. So recently, if you're in Val Verde County, you probably heard a lot of talk about this, or even just through social media. There's been kind of changing and differing guidance or plans for what's going to happen with border infrastructure along the Rio Grande. And so this is something that we're definitely keeping an eye on. These 4 sites, including Rattlesnake Canyon, as well as many other sites, if there were to be any sort of structure or barrier that was put up, we're not sure about what that would mean for access to these sites. Thankfully, right now, the Customs and Border Patrol website has kind of switched back to more detection technology. And so we're hopeful that it will remain that way and these sites won't be cut off. But this is something that we're definitely keeping an eye on. And it just, there's all kinds of threats to rock art sites along the Rio Grande and whether it's human made or nature made. But either way, we feel it's important to really prioritize documenting these sites. So exactly a year ago, the 2025 March Lunch and Learn, Karen kind of set the scene for the Rattlesnake Canyon project. She explained the work that Shumla had done in 2014 and 2015 when we were able to spend a good amount of time at the main Rattlesnake Canyon site proper. And so if you missed this last year or you just want a refresher, it's on our YouTube page. I recommend going to watch it. She covered a lot of stuff that I don't have time to cover today and just kind of showed the work that we started there and then showed how this project is really a continuation of that work, especially at the main Rattlesnake Canyon site. All right, so now to get into the goals of our project. So this project right now is we hope to finish it by 2028. We started it last year. So the first goal is to document the 4 sites in Rattlesnake Canyon using multiscalar approaches and methods that Shumla's developed over the last 15 years. And I'll talk about what that means and what those look like. To fully record the Rattlesnake Canyon site in the highest detail possible, we want to integrate both comprehensive documentation methods as well as analytical techniques, right? We want to learn as much as we can from this site before it's potentially damaged irreparably from flooding. Our third goal to collect data that can be used in tandem with previous Shumla documentation data for future rock art scholarship. So Shumla's been recording rock art in the region for 2 decades. I mean, you could really say 3 decades, but in earnest, 2 decades. And we've collected a lot of data and we have different methods that create different sets of data. So when we go into the methods, I'll kind of explain how we can use the data we're collecting now to talk to other data that we have from the past 20 years. And then our fourth goal to digitally preserve these sites and make them available for future generations to experience. And that can be done through very easily through sort of researcher type activities, but also we've been talking a lot about things like VR, right? And VR experiences. These sites are not easily accessible and eventually they will be gone. And so what are different ways, creative ways that we could go about providing experiences for people to see these sites? So for our methods, to achieve these goals, the methods will be varied. As I said, over the last 2 decades, we've developed, we've adopted, we've refined our documentation methods, and it's usually depending on the research design, right, the task and the desired achievement that we're hoping to get. In particular, we have what we call sort of different levels of documentation, and these are outlined on our website. If you go to our website, the research tab, I think it's called the Shumla method. They're outlined there, but I'm also going to cover them really briefly here as well. So for this project, we felt it was appropriate to do what we call baseline documentation or level 1 of VV 204, 205, and 628. So those are the sites that that presumably don't have a lot preserved, right? And so this, because it was remnant or fragmentary pictographs at these 3 sites, we wanted to use these methods because they're really great at collecting sort of high resolution data, but focused on broad scale patterns and details for the entire site and the entire panel, right? It's not really focused specifically on any one figure or element or symbol, but it captures sort of panel scale data. And so to do this, we incorporate, it's a lot of photography, 3 different kinds of photography typically. We do a structure from motion photogrammetry, which is to help us create 3D models to sort of kind of capture the context and the scene of the site. We use gigapanoramas, which is what Jared is using here. So we have our long lens camera on this robotic gimbal system. It zooms in really far, and then you can take photos, really high resolution, crisp photos of small areas that then stitch together and create awesome panoramas that you can zoom into and see a lot of details. And then just what we call general panel photography, but these are, again, just high resolution photography that's guided by, okay, we want to take a picture of preservation issues, or we want to take a picture of particular iconography that's visible, that kind of thing. Along with that, we'd do copious notes. So we'd fill out a text site, archaeological site form, which is the state of Texas form. And then we also developed our own rock art site form, which is sort of tailored to working in the lower Pecos. And it was everything from collecting panel measurements and figure counts to agents of deterioration, talking about research potential, and also importantly, the iconography at the site. We weren't getting into the nitty-gritty details, but we wanted to collect iconographic data that would allow future researchers to say, like, I want to look at all sites that have deer imagery, and they'd be able to search our database and pull that up. And then, of course, just site mapping. And we usually did that as, kind of the old school way of just sort of like tape measure and pace and compass sketch maps. Because again, this method, you collect a lot of high resolution data, but it's in a relatively short amount of time. So we weren't doing any sort of really comprehensive, LiDAR mapping or anything like that. That would be a totally different level. Um, for VV180, or Rattlesnake Canyon, we're using our most comprehensive methods, what we consider to be levels 2 and 3 of documentation, because it is extremely well preserved and it is rich with incredible imagery. So in these methods, we collect detailed data that's often tailored and focused on individual figures. And that data allows us to better understand how these figures come together and create the full mural. So what that looks like when we go to a site, first, the first thing we have to do is figure identification, description, and photography. And as I said, Karen goes into all of this in a lot more detail last year. But this can be a really time consuming step. If you've ever stood in front of one of these panels, especially if you're new and you've never been there before, it can be really intimidating because there's so much overpainting and interweaving of figures and paint overlapping one another. And until you also kind of start to understand the pattern of how the figures are portrayed, it can be difficult to sort of suss out like, okay, who does that atlatl belong to, and where does that adornment go to, and what is it coming off an elbow or a wrist, and so every figure gets its own identification number, its own set of description and notes, and its own set of photographs. Because with those photographs and all that note data, we complete graphic databases for each figure. So a graphic database is essentially it's a very comprehensive illustration. So we use Adobe Photoshop and drawing tablets, and the illustration is a major part of it, right? To get to know the figure, you spend time with it, you go through different photos, you look at close-ups, does it have 3 fingers or 2 fingers? But it also is a place where we can put data like microscopy data or radiocarbon data. You add all the associated figures with it so you can see how it interconnects to the rest of the panel. Along with that, when we're creating these graphic databases, we collect attribute data, which is arguably probably some of the most important data that we collect to enable to empower us for future studies of interpretation and trying to understand the imagery. The next step is going to be digital microscopy and Harris matrices. So we use digital microscopy at panels. Yes, we're looking at individual figures, but the goal is to understand how the paint was laid down on the wall, how the mural was created itself. Was it all in one go? Was it in a couple different painting episodes? What colors were laid down first? So we're really trying to understand the behavior of how these paintings were made. And to do that, we use this little digital Dynalite microscope. It's connected up to a laptop. And then back in the lab, we take all of that microscopy data and we create what's called Harris matrices. And there's other presentations that go way more into this method that we can point y'all to if you're interested. Another part of these methods for rattlesnake will be chemical analyses such as portable X-ray fluorescence and radiocarbon dating. I know Dr. Steelman has got a lot of ideas of kind of fun analytical techniques that she wants to try. Because again, if this site is going to be gone within the next couple of generations due to flooding or other things, we want to make sure that we learn as much as we possibly can from it. And then Finally, the sort of the piece de resistance of the whole method is to complete a full panel rendering using digital illustration. And this is really helpful in terms of being able to show how the painting was created or how the mural was painted in different sort of stages or different episodes. It's really great for outreach and for just visualization for folks who maybe aren't as used to looking at rock art as we are. These renderings can be very helpful. So in regard to our research questions, as you might expect, our research questions will differ slightly depending on the methods that we're using. So for the baseline sites, the first goal is really to add these three sites to the regional data set that we started in 2017 with what we called the Alexandria Project. So this is where we did baseline documentation at, I think we have that data for over 240 sites now. And this is an excellent place to start for like big picture studies, with the rock art site forum data that we collected and then the high resolution gigapans. You can use that data to kind of conduct your own studies almost as if you're at the site, which is really helpful. But other than that, we wanted to know, what diagnostic imagery remains at these three sites. Based on the tech sites, we saw that they were very fragmentary. They weren't in great condition. So what can we say about the imagery that's still there? And then from whatever is preserved, do we see any similarities or how does the imagery relate to the Rattlesnake Canyon site or other sites in the region? And then also, I guess another one would be, is there, because they are so threatened, is there anything more that should be done, right, besides just baseline when we go to these sites? And then for rattlesnake, for the level 2 and 3 data at Rattlesnake, the goal here is really to implement Shumla's comprehensive recording techniques at probably one of the most, I mean, not probably, it is one of the most robust sites in the region. We've done this type of documentation that's really figure focused for 20 to 30 sites in the region, but that was all done before we started incorporating the graphic databases step of our method. And so Rattlesnake will be the most well-documented site that we have record of by far, which is really exciting because I think this site really deserves it. One of the questions that you'll be able to look at with this data set is iconographic analyses of specific motifs, right? So when we're looking at these figures and we're asking questions like, what kind of headdress does it have? What kind of adornments does it have? What kind of paraphernalia is it wielding? It's adding a huge amount of data to Shumla's archive of sites that have that sort of level of attribute data. And there's a great quote that Dr. Boyd often uses from the book Visual Culture that says, by recognizing the attributes, we recognize the characters and the stories, and so help to crack the codes of much mythological and religious paintings. The attribute isn't there because it is a casual part of the scene, but because it is deliberately included to indicate significance beyond its physical existence. And so, what that's saying is, even in our culture, someone could start describing, let's say, a comic book character to you. Let's say, I always use the example of Thor. If someone were to start describing attributes or characteristics of Thor without saying the name of the person, you'd probably be able to pretty quickly know who they were talking about, right? And it's the same idea for the paintings here. The people who knew the stories, who were painting these images and these characters, they embedded that type of information into the paintings. So that's the type of data, that's the type of insight that we're trying to gain access to by collecting all of this attribute data. And so rattlesnake, there's, spoiler, there's over 300 figures there. So it's a lot of data for us to work with in that regard. Another research question, using digital microscopy, we want to know, does the painting sequence follow the dark to light painting order that we've seen at other sites in the region, where it goes from black, red, yellow to white? And also, does the panel production evidence suggest it was one painting episode or was it multiple painting episodes? These are questions that we can ask with microscopy. We also want to know, how old is Rattlesnake Canyon? So this is something that I'm really excited about. But also, does that evidence match with our microscopy? Does it suggest one painting episode? Does it suggest multiple painting episodes? And then how does that compare to nearby sites? We've been really expanding our data set of dated sites, radiocarbon dated sites. So we have a lot more information to work with. There's there's opportunity to date specific motifs such as rabbit ear headdresses, speech breath, felines, otherworld journey motifs. There's all kinds of really interesting motifs at Rattlesnake that we could target to understand when those symbols are being painted. I put this little figure up here for an example. So this rabbit-eared anthropomorph that has speech breath coming out is dated at Eagle Cave, which is, more or less nearby in the grand scheme of Val Verde County. And it dated to about 3,500 years ago. And so, how do rabbit-eared figures at Rattlesnake that also have speech breath, how do those compare? And so those are really exciting sort of things that we want to look at. And this is just a sample. There's infinite research questions that could be addressed with this data. So to get into a little bit of the results. So in 2025, we made really great progress towards our goals. We completed baseline documentation at 204, 205, and 628. And we wanted to focus on that for the 2025 field season because we didn't have any data for those sites previously. We had done baseline documentation at Rattlesnake back in 2020, and we had also done some other work in 2014, 2015 there, but these had zero data. So we wanted to make sure that we captured them before, just in case a major flood came through. And then with the leftover time, we continued work at the Rattlesnake Canyon site with figure identification and figure photography. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these. So baseline results at VV 204. So this particular site has two panels that span approximately 80 meters. So this is panel 2 here, and then panel 1 is up around the corner. And panel 1 really just has truly fragments of paint left. There's really no discernible imagery at all. But in panel 2 is where you have some figures that we can actually talk about and make observations about. There are, I don't know if I mentioned earlier, there's at least 14 or so groundstone bedrock feature workstations in the canyon. So bedrock mortars or shallow grinding surfaces. There's several of those associated with this site as well. So here is, just to kind of get a little close up, here's a part of panel 2 with David for scale. I think David said he's 6'5", so it's pretty big. And you can see this line right here is a really stark scour line from past flooding. And so most of the imagery, really all of the imagery that's still describable, discernible, is above that scour line. It kind of is, it might fool you. David looks pretty comfortable here, but if you zoom out, this is what this is what it really looked like. You have David up here, trying not to slide down, and you have Deanna taking photographs, trying not to fall into the pool of water, and then you have Karen looking concerned in the corner, trying to figure out how she can help make sure that we stay safe. So this is all part of a day's work in the field with Shumla. Because the preserved imagery was up so high on the wall, the best tool for kind of preservation and for us to be able to kind of really see the pictographs was using the Gigapan. Again, because you can zoom in, we use a 100-400 lens, you can zoom in quite far, get really crisp photos, and then stitch those all together to be able to see details in these panels. And so it was pretty long, so we ended up splitting this panel into 6 sections, and I want to take a look at 3 of them just to kind of show some of the imagery that's still there. So this is section 1. This may not look like much, and to be honest, there's not much left preserved. But as you start to learn the patterns in Pecos River style imagery, let me put a D-stretch up. A couple things might jump out at you, right? You might see this sort of U shape and think, oh, okay, that could be maybe an anthropomorph with a U-shaped head. That's relatively common in the style. You might see this symbol over here, which you recognize to be a staff and what we call a power bundle. These are often wielded by anthropomorphs. Add an illustration, take it away. And so while there's not much left preserved, I think we can definitely say at one point in time there was probably a human figure here with speech breath coming up, a staff in what would be its left hand, and a power bundle extending off, But unfortunately, we've lost the remainder of it, right? Another example, this is a different section. So I'm just gonna put, you can definitely see like, okay, there's quite a bit of red paint here. There's even some black paint down below the scour line, although it's really hard to tell what it is. Um, There we go. We've actually got a couple of sideways anthropomorphs here, which is really cool. Let me put up the illustration and then take it away because I know these are difficult to see. This is a really neat one here. You've kind of got like a barbell body shape going on. It's possible there's white paint filling in those areas. And then this really interesting a horizontal anthropomorph that has a staff and a power bundle coming off and speech breath, just tons of splatter paint all around with both big dots and kind of small, forceful spray as well. But this is a good example of why the sort of level 2, level 3 data can be difficult because when we're collecting that kind of data on sites that are not well preserved like this, you get to a figure like this where we think it's an anthropomorph. This is actually a really tiny arm right here, but the rest of the details are not very clear because they've been scoured away. And so collecting that data where you're trying to count how many digits are on the hand or what paraphernalia it's holding, you don't necessarily capture a lot of that information. And then the final one I want to look at from this site, which is probably my favorite section, you can kind of see there's an anthropomorph or human-like figure here. It's got all kinds of lines, like energy lines around it. There's some deer down here in the corner. You might say, well, how do you know it's a deer? Well, I'll put up the illustration, then I'll take it away. So maybe you can see it. If you keep your eye on this area, you can see there's an antler tine there, and we have more of a deer preserved down here. So probably two deer, at least two deer here at one time. What we call an otherworld journey motif. So we have an archway over here with a power bundle coming down through it, which we also see at the Rattlesnake Canyon site. So it's cool to see those kind of parallels. So actually, I mean, while a lot of the site is light is gone, there was more preserved there than I was imagining there would be, and some pretty cool stuff too. Take that away. Moving on to VV205. So this is what's called the missionary shelter. So we recorded one panel there spanning 26 meters, and we weren't able to determine any of the traces of the earlier paint that was described in the 80s and 90s forums. There is this bit of this is the best preserved paint, and you can tell it's kind of tucked away into that corner, perhaps a little bit more protected from the flooding. But it's pretty bright paint, but it's not what we'd call diagnostic imagery, so we can't necessarily say anything about the time period when it was painted. Um, Section 2 is where the historic imagery is, or was, sort of still is. And it's if you're used to looking at rock art, if you're used to looking at limestone walls, you might be able to look at that and say, okay, yeah, I can kind of maybe see there's some remnants of red paint here. But it really is with the aid of D-stretch that you're able to start to pull out some of those details. And so now you can kind of start to see the shape of what they call the mission. You might be able to see a circle here and a cross. But it's really with the help of those early watercolors that we're able to actually kind of find everything. So we'll just kind of go through the probable horse or the quadruped that they had drawn is right here. You can discern the neck and the snout, especially. The rest of the body, I think if you know what it's supposed to look like, you can kind of tell it's there, but not very much. One of those X's that is in the paint is in the watercolor is still preserved. Handprints on the left-hand side. This one, the upper one, is better preserved than the lower one. It's hard to say if we didn't have these early watercolors, would we know, especially that this lower one's a handprint? Maybe not. And then, of course, the sort of mission itself. And we'll come back to if that is a mission or not. And then finally, at VV 628, this one's probably my favorite. We recorded one panel that's 24 meters long. And I mean, at one point in time, this canyon bottom is very dynamic, right? So the floors have probably changed levels many times throughout its lifetime. Currently, at its state, you have to use a ladder to get up into this shelter. Here's the crew here, happy. It's always great. We can get in the field. And again, this is, you might be able to see some kind of remnant painting behind them. This was the site that the 1992 crew called unspectacular. And we would beg to differ, but we beg to differ only because we have, modern technology that can help us see more. Without that, I can definitely understand how you would say, oh, wow, man, this probably was really cool, but not anymore. So yeah, here's an example of section one of the panel. If you're familiar with looking at rock art, you might key in on this sort of black image over here. I'll put up a D-stretch. You can see it's a large anthropomorph with rabbit ear figures, another black figure next to it. And there's quite a bit here, but it's in relatively poor condition. So you have another sort of horizontal anthropomorph with rabbit ears. You have rayed dots, which we see a lot of rayed dots at Rattlesnake Canyon. All right, this was probably the hair of an anthropomorph that's no longer preserved. So sad day for that. And this is probably my favorite section. So you can probably see there's a pretty good figure right here, perhaps another one right here. And when you put up the D-stretch, stuff really pops out at you and starts to come to life. So yeah, you have a black and red anthropomorph here, quite long. The feet are all the way down here. The head is up here. It has hair, or what we call piloerection, all around its body. There's another one here. You can see its arms, legs. It's holding an atlatl, and it has a power bundle going off to the left. And as I was creating these illustrations, I noticed something down here that caught my eye, this sort of red crenulated shape. And this is a very common symbol in Pecos River style. So you have sort of this outlined red crenulated shape that's infilled with black. So after I was done doing this quick illustration, I realized like, wow, there actually is quite a bit here. So we have this row of rabbit-eared, this procession of rabbit-eared anthropomorphs here, probably another row here that's not very well preserved. And these mimic what's going on in the Rattlesnake Canyon site perfectly. There's all kinds of processions of little figures going across the Rattlesnake Canyon site. So this was really neat to kind of see like, wow, there's actually quite a bit preserved left here, and this might be worthy of doing sort of some of that level 2 documentation where you collect attribute data on these figures because there's a decent amount left. So I see I'm running out of time. I'll speed up a little bit. So some of the takeaways for our baseline documentation, I think overall there was more preserved than what we thought based on the TechSite forums, but that's largely because we have the help of modern technology. And really that imagery is only visible above the flood scour line. And then VV205, the missionary shelter, is in the worst condition. And I think that likely all remnants of that historic imagery will likely be gone within our lifetime. I think that's just the reality of it. So we're really grateful for the early watercolors, and we're grateful that we got to get out there as well and do our documentation. So one thing, even though we were several decades too late to capture a more preserved missionary shelter, we can still use this site for some interesting comparative studies. There are only so many known depictions of missions or sort of mission adjacent images in our region. So this is again missionary shelter. We have 2 from Myers Springs, which is in Terrell County, and then one on sort of the south central side of Val Verde County of Vaquero Shelter. Lately, there's been some interesting discussion about, especially the ones at Myers Springs, perhaps being sort of anthropomorphized missions, so sort of a combination of the missionary and the mission itself, or perhaps even maybe representing Apache Gone dancers. So all kinds of interesting research. I do think I wanted to point out, I think it's really interesting that when you look at this example from Myers Springs, where you have the structure and then you have sort of this priestly figure down here, it does bear some striking resemblances to what's going on here at Rattlesnake at Missionary Shelter. Let's see. So we have sort of this round head with little round ears and a cross coming up from the headdress. And then you also have these four crosses alongside of it, which if you look and compare it to what we have at Missionary Shelter, you have sort of a round head, the little round ears, the cross coming up, and then also the surrounding crosses around the mission. So I think it kind of lends credence to the idea that this could be sort of an anthropomorphized mission, right? The combination of the human and the structure together. And these are the types of analyses and studies that we hope people will undertake with that baseline data set that we're collecting, right? It has a lot of imagery, a lot of notes, and it creates a robust base for folks to do deep dives into these types of symbols. And then I wanted to show really quickly another example of sort of a regional comparison from Vibora. So as I was doing these quick illustrations, this area over here kind of caught my eye. You have these circles, black circles with red dots in them, which seems kind of like innocuous and like, okay, yeah, it's red circles or it's red dots within black circles, but it's not necessarily a really common motif seen in Pecos River style. And as I was drawing it, I thought, gosh, I've seen this somewhere else before, but only one other place. And then I was able to confirm that we have sort of a similar type of symbolism going on at a site that's on the far east side of the county in the Devil's River drainage. So pretty far away. And yeah, it's not identical, but you have similar types of symbols happening. So this is, again, it seems like, okay, yeah, maybe that's whatever, but this is how we start to understand the symbology and the associations and start to make those interpretations about how these symbols are functioning for people. And we were able to make some progress at Rattlesnake proper in 2025. So like I said, we wanted to do the baseline first, but then once we finished that, we were able to spend some time continuing figure identification and figure photography at Rattlesnake. And when we left Rattlesnake last year, we left the field with around 280 figures identified. But since then, we have spent a lot of time in the lab working with that data and identifying even more figures. So in archaeology, folks typically say, for every 1 day in the field, you have at least 3 days in the lab. For us, I would say the ratio is a little bit more skewed towards the lab side because we can collect a ton of data, photographic data in 10 days. We're not excavating, which is a little more time consuming. But it will absolutely take us longer than 30 days to finish the lab portion of that data or of that work. And so we've been working on creating graphic databases for the figures that we have photographs for, collecting attribute data. Often as we're spending time looking closely at these photos, we're finding new figures that we had missed in the field. So I think we're now up to 340 figures at Rattlesnake Canyon. This is often what we're doing. We're gathering at our maps in the office and discussing like, okay, well, I just found this weird thing over here and I see it connects to this and that. So it's pretty detail-oriented work and sometimes you got to go take a step outside and get some fresh air. But I wanted to give a quick shout out to Deanna's Lunch and Learn from September. If you're interested in learning about the graphic database procedure and sort of the step-by-step method of it to see why it's so time intensive, definitely go give that a watch on our YouTube. And then also stuff we've been doing to prepare for 2026 is microscopy planning. This has been a huge part of our preparations because we want to go into the field armed with a plan of action to be the most efficient we can and to be the most organized we can. If we're trying to make sure that we look at all the intersections of colors within figures and between figures, we need to have a good idea of where we can go to see those interactions. And so all the staff has been working really hard on creating these maps of dynolite locations. So I'll zoom in a little bit so you can get an idea. The yellow dots are dynolite data from 2014, 2015, and the white dots are locations that we will be capturing in upcoming field work. And so I know I'm getting really close to times. I think I'm at the end here. So that's what we've been up to for Rattlesnake Canyon. We're really happy with the progress thus far. And we head out there within the next month to finish figure photography and make a large dent on our microscopy fieldwork. So stay tuned for more updates later this year, and I think I have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
From Marx, can determination be made on the height of painting above the floor when the paintings were made?
On the height of painting?
Can determination be made on the height of painting above the floor when paintings were made?
I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but I mean, right now we can already tell that the painting goes quite high. I think I said the tallest figure is about 2 meters tall. Um, And so we presumably that painting extended down on the registers of the panel that are now covered in silt as well. So I mean, in total, I would be interested. And I know Karen has some ideas about different instruments you can use to try to see if there's still sort of paint signatures that we can detect through the dust, even though we can't see it. So that would be an interesting way to look at how much was covered from these different flooding events. So I think hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, and then from John, is there any information that the quasi-mission figures date from the time that Europeans have been in the area?
So a lot of that's going to we haven't done any radiocarbon dating on the historic imagery. So a lot of it comes from sort of those contextual clues of the crosses. There's horse imagery. So it's certainly post-European contact. But in terms of an exact date, we don't have that.
Okay, from Margliff, awesome presentation plan and using all the tools in the box. I especially like you were able to use Carson's paintings, a fun new addition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
We're really, really grateful for those early artists who went out and did watercolors across the landscape.
from Laurie, how do you determine what color's on top when the colors are close or have bled through?
Really great question. So she's talking about the microscopy there. It can be really difficult. So in our microscopy sort of process, we note what colors we're analyzing. So if we're looking at black and red, red and yellow, black and white, black and black, red and red. And then when we're back in the lab, we sort of go through it like a blind process where one analyst goes through and makes determinations, and that can also end in a I'm not sure or I can't tell if it's and that often happens when you have red on red, black on black. The second person will go through, make their determinations, and then a third person will go through and check to see if they agree, or if they don't agree, they'll act as a tiebreaker. But sometimes, especially when you have the same color on top of each other, it can be really difficult to make that determination.
From David, what does it microscopy information conclude? Were the paintings made in multiple painting events, or were they usually created in one sitting? Also, was the paint applied in specific color sequence? I think you answered a little bit of that just before.
Yeah, I mean, in short, we don't have that answer for rattlesnake yet, but at previous sites that we've done this analysis, so far it follows a pretty strict rule where you have the darkest paint going up to the lightest paint. So you have blacks, then reds, then yellows, then whites. So it means all of the black paint was applied first, then all of the red, then all of the yellow, and then the white. Um, and then, sorry, the second half of the question I already forgot.
It's about when they were created, were they created
And
one
yes,
sitting?
thank you.
Yeah.
And so far, yeah, it does appear that these murals, by and large, are created in one composition, right? In one context, in one episode.
I had a question real quick, if I may.
Sure.
Please.
So, going back to the color sequence and the application and the painting events. So, I'm working with a couple of artists to recreate these panels and whatnot. But I was interested, one of the things that I spoke to about the artists, was how these people gathered their paint. And one of the things that they had told me was that, as from an art perspective, that if we wanted to do something like that, that it would have to be specific to the materials we were gathering, and that would be seasonal. Which
Mm,
leads me to the impression that the painting, which they believe was made in multiple painting events, multiple sequences, because they were like, if we have to get this specific type of
Yeah.
material, then it's seasonal. It's only available during a certain time of year.
Hmm. Hmm.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, as far as Pecos River style goes, for the pigment source, it's all mineral based, and so you would have had folks crushing manganese and then different iron minerals, whether they be yellow, red, and then white. We're not entirely sure about, but uh, you'd be crushing up that material and then you'd be combining it with likely water, likely some type of binder. So probably our best hypothesis right now is animal fat, but there are other materials that could also be used as binders. That I think most of them are probably available year round. Things like tree sap or you could use blood as a binder. Egg yolks, although eggs probably are seasonally available, when birds are nesting. And then you have the emulsifier part of it, which is could have been things like yucca root juice, which would have been available during most times of year. But that being said, there also could have been sort of rules or restrictions or cultural rules about when these paintings could have been produced, right? Maybe it was only during a certain season or time of year, and we don't really have a good handle on that yet. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about.
When you say that you think they were all created at the same time, you're speaking of each cavern or each enclosure?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So each panel, sort of think each mural, not necessarily every we know that Pecos River style spans, over 4,000 years. So this paint style, this tradition existed for a really long time. So these ideas and these symbols um, lasted for quite some time. But each mural so far, based on the ones we've studied, have been painted in one episode.
I have a question. This is Robin. Okay, you're speaking about being one episode. You're going to have to let the paint dry. So doesn't that sort of indicate a couple of days or 3 or 4 days?
Sure. And that's, it'd be really interesting to do like a massive experiment on what it would take to how long, how quickly, or how not quickly could you do this sort of painting. And also, I think it's important to note that when I say one episode, we don't necessarily know if that means truly in just a couple of weeks or if that's a couple of months or a couple of years, but sort of one concentrated effort in a relatively short amount of time. Because previously, people thought that these murals, people just would come add to them, across, hundreds of years, centuries, or millennia, right? And I don't think that's the case. I think it was accomplished in a much shorter amount of time, relatively speaking.
I have a question. Do the stylistic similarities between the mission and the older stuff, do they lead you to indicate the same cultures produced those?
Mm. I mean, the mission imagery, I think, is quite different than the Pecos River style, and I think it was probably created by different people. Now, if you're talking about the missions, the mission imagery amongst itself, I think that it is possible that they were done by similar groups. And especially, Rattlesnake Canyon being on sort of the western half of Val Verde County is not that far away from the Myers Springs site in Terrell County, relatively speaking. And so I think it's plausible that you could have had the same group kind of painting that idea of maybe like a conflated missionary and mission together.
Tony, you have a question?
Yes. Was red ochre ever used in any of these caverns, caves, and the paintings?
Yes, definitely. So red ochre, being an iron-rich mineral, would have been the primary pigment ingredient for this paint.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And that's not to say they couldn't have used other organic materials, but we just haven't been able to detect those chemically. No, I just thank you so much, and we will catch you at another Lunch and Learn soon.